Chapter 26 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or an Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 26. Several Added Links. The influences which had drawn young Barrows to the house of prayer thus early in his Christian life were easily traced. In the first place, though Robert Parks might have been astonished had any one told him that such was the case, he really had greater moral courage than Robert. He was ready and willing, the momentous question having been decided once for all, to show his colors. Besides, his mother, when she bade him good-bye on Monday at daybreak, had said to him, "Let me think of you as in prayer meeting on Wednesday evening, my son. I'll try to imagine what you will say, and I shall be the happiest mother there is in the world." After that, it would have taken a good deal to have kept him away from the meeting. He had always loved his mother with a very tender love, and it astonished him not a little to see how much dearer she had grown under the spell of this new experience. He had given a good deal of thought to the part of his mother's sentence which indicated that she took it as a matter of course that he would have something to say in the prayer meeting. It made his face burn to think of such a thing, yet it looked altogether reasonable, and he had almost decided that he would, when the time came, rise to his feet and make it known that he was now on the Lord's side. But he had not counted on the presence of Robert Parks. There were certain other things connected with that evening which were matters of surprise to the two young gentlemen who were unacquainted with prayer meetings. They both knew that a very large congregation was connected with the Packard Place Church, and that on Sabbath mornings the large house was well filled. The question which these two young men revolved in their ignorant minds was, what became of all these people on Wednesday evening? A large, elegant room, light and beautiful, and people enough gathered in it to have played 2 or 3 games of puss in the corner, and that was all. After fully taking in his surroundings, Robert Parks bestowed such a puzzled look on his companion that she laughed outright. As the meeting progressed, other developments bewildered the strangers. Deacon Jones, on being appealed to, offered a very long, well-arranged prayer. Then there was a pause, until Mr. Smith responded to his invitation in much the same manner, with an increase as to length, and then there was another pause. The minister had already prayed, and read, and spoken, and done what he could to infuse life into the dry bones by which he seemed surrounded. But long and solemn pauses marked the hour. Meantime, Robert Parks was revolving an idea. How was he to get up in the midst of this ponderous, this awful meeting, and say the few trembling words that he had to offer? It seemed to him an impossibility. He had looked over at young Barrows, and fancied him as turning this strange gathering to account among his friends. Barrows knew how to be both witty and sarcastic on occasion. How would he relish being included in a description such as he felt might be given? Hester Mason, meantime, was troubled with no anxious thoughts, but found herself yawning behind her new kid gloves, and telling herself that of all the stupid places where she had ever been in her life, a prayer meeting was the most so. What could have possessed Robert to want to come? He certainly was not having any fun. The occasional glances toward him showed his face to be as solemn as the minister's. She half imagined that he was trying to punish her for coaxing him to church on the Sabbath. Then suddenly the Packard Place prayer meeting had a sensation. Joy Saunders had watched and waited and prayed, and grown red and white by turns in the intensity of her emotions. Here were 2 young men and a young woman, who, so far as she knew, had never been in a prayer meeting before. What would they think of it? Why had they come? Oh, if somebody would only say or do something! Had God sent these 3 to that place to be helped? Were they being helped? Were Christians doing right to sit there in that dull way, letting the time run to waste, as though there were nothing to say for Christ? Joy Saunders belonged to a church which believed in women's sphere, and desired her to keep strictly within its limits, to give herself with what abandon she pleased to its fairs and festivals and theatricals and what not, to circulate its subscription papers, and be instant, in season and out of season, in planning for its secular interests, but on no account to let her voice be heard in its social religious meetings. Heretofore had Joy, with views of her own, kept carefully within her supposed sphere, living up to the supposed views of St. Paul, when he said that if women would learn anything they were to ask their husbands at home; sometimes troubled, it is true, about that great company of women who had no husbands to ask, and often troubled about the so-called social meeting, because it appeared to her to be a very unsocial place. Yet in her wildest moments of longing after reform, it had never occurred to her that she could do so unusual a thing as to let her voice be heard in that particular prayer meeting. There had been prayer meetings in which she felt able to do it, but not in this church. If it were a teachers' meeting, she admitted to herself, the thing might be possible. No matter if the teachers' meetings were held in the same room, and with sometimes as many present as attended the prayer meeting. It was certainly very different. They all talked then. Yet, despite this pressure of circumstance and inclination, I have to record an astounding fact. So eager was Joy that the pause which she considered disgraceful should be broken, that she did actually break it herself. So filled was her heart with one Bible verse and the thoughts which had clustered around it, that it seemed almost as though some force outside of herself impelled her to speak the words: "And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still. And he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up, and began to speak." Before the last tremulous word had ceased vibrating on the air, Austin Barrows was on his feet. "I never before thought that I was a coward," he said, "but that same one has spoken to me. He has said to me, Young man, arise. He has brought me to life. And I had almost gone away from here tonight without owning it, though I came here for that purpose. I hope he will forgive me. Now that I am fairly on my feet, I want you to know that my determination is to serve him." Apparently this was just the force that Robert Parks needed. Instantly he arose. Just a few broken words, yet have you any idea of how they thrilled through that audience? At the young man's left sat a silent pillar who had helped to support the church for 20 years, and yet whose voice had never been heard in the prayer meeting. While the thrill of the young new voices was still upon them, he arose. "Brethren," he said, "I am condemned. The voice of Christ spoke life to my soul many years ago, and I have never owned it in words before. It is the 11th hour with me, but I want to be a witness for him." What a wonderful meeting that grew into! What was there about it that sent Mr. Cady's mind roving through his store, intent on certain reforms which might be carried out there? What set Mr. Wheeler to thinking of certain men in his employ who ought to be in the prayer meeting, and determining that before another week his business should be so arranged that they could come if they would? If I should try to follow out all the trains of thought that were quickened into being by the quotation of that single Bible verse, and the response to it by those two young men, you would be able to see that it reached farther and affected more lives and plans and futures than apparently had all the prayer meetings of the years gone by since the Packard Place Church had a being. The truth is that Joy Saunders had stepped very far out of her apparent sphere, further than she knew or than others dreamed. She had set in motion forces that are pulsing yet. More than that, the waves of her influence are widening and widening, and will continue to widen and deepen until they are lost in the ocean of eternity. She did not know it. What had she done? Nothing but repeat a simple verse from the last Sabbath's lesson. And her cheeks were crimson over the effort it had cost her. There were those who said it was rather queer in Joy Saunders. Did she think that there were not men enough to do that sort of thing? Could not the minister read all the Bible verses that were necessary? Nobody quite understood why the simple act should have had such an effect. Not even Joy remembered that she had used the sword of the Spirit, which the Lord had promised to honor. "Well," said Austin Barrows, as Robert Parks crossed the aisle that separated them, and the two clasped hands. And "Well," said Robert in the same breath. This effort seemed to exhaust their powers of expression. They wrung each other's hands after the manner of young men who could say a great deal if they could only get started. They looked into each other's astonished, beaming eyes, and were silent. After a moment both laughed. "I was never so amazed in my life," declared Barrows at last. "You can't equal me in that, at least," answered Parks. "In the first place, I was so astonished to see you here at all that it took half the evening to rally from the effect. You must have a long story to tell me. Suppose I join you in half an hour from now?" Then they shook hands again, and for want of words they laughed again. "They don't seem to feel very serious," Miss Hall said, overhearing only the laugh. "I should think young men who had taken the position that they have tonight ought to have some other feeling than amusement. I shouldn't be a bit surprised if this were just one of their jokes and they didn't mean a word of it." But Joy Saunders, who understood both young men much better than Miss Hall did, and had no such fears concerning them, answered almost with a gleeful voice: "I suppose, if the truth were known, they never had a better reason for laughing or for shouting than they have tonight." Said Miss Hall: "You extreme people are very queer. Now you are one thing, and in a moment another. I hardly ever understand you." Chapter 27.